We're not just talking about Matthew today. I'm going to show you some deep hole Bible nerd stuff. So get ready. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And we'll dive in here. Now, I do not trust that my computer is not going to do this to me again. So if you lose me, give me 5 minutes and try again. And otherwise, we'll just kind of keep our fingers crossed. Okay, we're doing 16 through 18 today. Okay, I want to talk a little bit. We covered John last week, and I think it's, I wanted to go back and just spend a little more time. So last week we heard the story of the bloody head on the plate, right? Okay, so here's what we know about John. Luke is the only one that says that John is Jesus's cousin. Probably not accurate. That's in the, biblical narrative. So kind of take that one off the table. We know that he was an ascetic, kind of like the folks that will the Essenes, where they'll find all of the gospels in the caves. Those people who have kind of separated themselves off from society. He's eating only locusts and wild honey, right? So we know that he's leading a very, very simple life. Best guess is he was a contemporary Jesus, an older contemporary. His ministry starts first. And a lot of biblical scholars think that because John baptized Jesus, that Jesus was a follower of John before beginning his own ministry. Okay, so a lot of times you'll hear me make a comment about, well, in the historical record, they'll say this. So this is really important. What is the historical record? So the historical record is not the Bible. So set that aside. The vast majority of our ancient historical record from this time period and this location was by a guy named Josephus. And he was a Jew who was in Jerusalem, grew up right around the time Jesus died, very well educated, maybe a scribe. He knew both Jewish and Greek texts. And during the Jewish rebellion, so remember Jesus dies about 30, and then all of Judea explodes in rebellion. And about 3 decades later, Romans come in and shut it down brutally, take it all the way to Jerusalem, where they destroy the temple. The last kind of rebels are die at Masada. So Josephus was a Jewish general in that rebellion. And when he was overcome by the Romans, he and 40 of his compatriots fled, agreed to commit suicide. Josephus rigged it, and his name came out last. And after most everybody had killed themselves, he convinced everybody else to surrender. And pretty survivalist skills. Once he is captured by the Romans, he convinces them that he is the right person to write the history of the rebellion. And the Romans have him do that. They take him back to Rome, and he writes this firsthand account of the fall of Jerusalem. So that's kind of our primary historical document. But here's the problem with it. He was there, but he is now writing for and in Rome. So it's a little biased perspective. It's not the Jewish perspective. It's the Roman story of conquest is what we have from Josephus. And then he did a second piece, which is the entire history of the Jews from Alexander the Great to that destruction of the Second Temple. And that one is where we find the references to Jesus of Nazareth. So when you hear the historical record around this time, this is who either I or others are referencing. Okay. So what did Josephus say about John? He did talk about John in that second piece of work, and he said John was attracting large crowds, and Herod feared John might incite a rebellion. He says that Herod arrests John, imprisoned him, and has him executed. It doesn't go into any dancing, any daughter-in-laws, any head on a bloody plate. So this is what is in the historical record from Josephus on John. So based on this, most people agree that Herod Antipas was responsible for killing him, and why John died was preventing large-scale rebellion. Okay, there is a lot of theories that yes, in fact, he was beheaded, and that's how it ended up in the Matthew story. And it was because at that point in time, it was one of the more common ways to execute a political prisoner. Okay, so interestingly enough, the only reference to John's death is something that we read last week, which was Jesus's reaction. And he says, now when Jesus heard about John's death, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. Very subtle, very beautiful depiction of that moment of grief for Jesus. That's only in Matthew. That's only in Matthew. Okay, so last week we covered a whole lot. There was walking on water, there was feeding, there was John, more feeding. Jesus got confronted by the Canaanite women and put in his place. This week there's more teaching and preaching. We're going to start to deal with the concept of Messiah and Jesus predicting his death. We'll get the transfiguration, and we're going to deal with perhaps the weirdest story in the entire Bible, the temple tax found in the fish, unique to Matthew. And we'll talk about sin a bit. Okay, let's dive in with chapter 16. I'm just going to call on people. Chris, will you read this one?
Sure. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Be careful, Jesus said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They discussed this among themselves and said, it is because we didn't bring any bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, you have little faith. That's the one thing I always say. Oh, ye of little faith. We were just talking about that, Marci, while you were hooking up here. Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets full you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in the bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees.
Okay, so for those of you who did Mark with me, I want you to kind of notice a couple of progressions here. And even if you didn't do Mark with me, remember Mark's the earlier first gospel. In Matthew, we've gone 20 years in the future, and the Christian movement has progressed. And one of the things I told you about Matthew is there's softening of Matthew towards the disciples. So this similar in Mark is basically Jesus calling them dense and not getting it and getting really angry and frustrated, right? But here in Matthew, just in 20 years, there's some revisionistic interpretation of the disciples and their denseness. And they're not that dense. Yes, they don't get it at first, but Jesus explains it, and then the light goes off, and oh, they do get it. Very, very different than how the disciples are portrayed in the Gospel of Mark. And that's going to continue on in terms of kind of that softening of the disciples' receptivity to Jesus's message. The other thing that's going to happen, you know, that we've talked about this several times, is Matthew is going to really come down on the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So, and we've talked about this almost every class, so I'm not going to go into this much. But just again to emphasize, the destruction of the temple by the Romans happens in the 70s. Matthew writes about 10 years after that destruction. After the temple's destruction and the Romans shutting down the rebellion in Judea, there's all the Jews that are left are either slaves or running, and they've moved all over the Mediterranean. And the Jewish religion was in this time of massive transition, coming out of a temple model to a rabbi synagogue model, and a lot of attempts to preserve Jewish identity, right? With everything that had been destroyed, how to preserve that Jewish identity. And Matthew's group is caught up in that as kind of little rebels coming up with a different way to be Jewish. And it's not well received, okay? So you're seeing the early stages of the parting of the ways from Judaism and Christianity. Okay, so the other thing, what's happening in here is that the Jewish officials are asking for a sign that Jesus is the Messiah. And Jesus thinks they're trying to trick him, which he's right. You know, we already know they're plotting against him. And so he doesn't do it. And he basically says, look, if I have to do signs, then God's making me into a circus performer. I'm not going to do it, right? And the irony for Jesus and for Matthew is that Jesus is demonstrating all of these things. Like we've just had the stories of the feedings, we've had the story of the walking on water, we've had the healings, and they're not being recognized by the Jewish officials, right? So what it really is a move to discredit, not really a move to find out more about Jesus's movement. So who are the Pharisees and the Sadducees? So the Pharisees, middle-class people taught in the synagogues, believed in the Messiah, right? So, and when the Messiah comes, there would be this era of world peace. The Sadducees were the upper class, wealthy, worked in the temple, very elitist. And the two parties compose that Sanhedrin, which is that Jewish Supreme Court that in some of the Gospels we're going to hear about, where Jesus is going to be tried. So it's made up of both of those factions. Okay, let's keep on with chapter 16. Diane, will you take this one?
Sure. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah.
Okay, so at this time, a lot of the Jews believed that God is going to send this anointed king, the Messiah. The Messiah, this anointed king, that's what it means, is going to be the spearhead of this movement that's going to liberate Israel from Roman occupation and oppression. And in doing that is going to spread peace and justice all over the world. So that's what you find in kind of the prophets' writings. And so nobody knew who or where this king is going to be born, but they knew he was a descendant of King David. And that's why we saw that lineage, that genealogy that started Matthew, because it's tying it to this understanding. And again, anointed king is what we usually hear and understand as Messiah. The king fulfills Israel's scriptures. So again, think back to how many times you have heard Matthew so far say, "In fulfillment of the scriptures, in fulfillment of the scriptures, in fulfillment of the scriptures." Matthew is building his case that Jesus is the Messiah to his fellow Jews. There were a lot of would-be messiahs around the time that Jesus came. And what happened was once the leader was killed or caught or imprisoned or just disappeared, the movement died away, right? So what's going to be very different is what's going to happen with Jesus, or the movement's not going to die. And it was kind of a death sentence to be labeled a Messiah, because once you were labeled a Messiah and the King of the Jews, then it's a very subversive statement. It's a very subversive political statement to Rome that they don't recognize the legality of the Roman Empire. Not a title you really want. Okay. I'm going to talk about this one. In chapter 17, when they came together in Galilee, he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life. And the disciples were filled with grief. Okay, this is the second time Jesus is going to predict his death. Again, very similar to what we saw in Mark. Matthew's pulling this from Mark directly. And the real hard piece of this is that is not how the Messiah story is supposed to end. So he's already told them he's the Messiah, right? They know how that story is supposed to end, that the King of the Jews will liberate Judea from Roman occupation, bring justice and peace to the world, not die. Okay, so he says it twice because this is a pretty shocking thing. This is what they think the Messiah is. He's saying this is actually what's going to happen, and they're going to struggle with it. So, okay, let's deal with a very odd story. Very odd story. Bernie, would you like to read the odd story?
Yeah, okay, but let me ask you a question. Yeah. Is it possible that Jesus was saying, I am not the Messiah, by giving a different ending to the Messiah?
Oops, hold on. Let me go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing that. So here's the problem with not knowing the answer to that one, because we are in post-Easter literature right now, right? So most guesses are that Jesus wasn't trying to start a religious movement. He was working within the Jewish culture. So it's really hard to say whether or not this language that shows up in Mark, it's the first times it shows up, and then it's going to follow into Matthew and into Luke, that Jesus is going to ask them, who do you think I am? Who do you think I am? And they're going to say this, and he's going to deny it or tell them to keep it secret. So it's hard to know whether or not, Mark, the original author of this, was writing as a post-Easter and putting that interpretation on, or this is stuff that Jesus said. Because it's in 3 of the Gospels, it gives it a kind of a more highly likelihood that this is more of the sayings or the teachings of Jesus. But hard to know on this one. So, does that answer your question, Bernie?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions before we jump in? Okay, let's go to the weird story. Okay, Bernie.
After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Yes, he does, he replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. What do you think, Simon? He asked. From whom do the king of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others? From others, Peter answered. Then the children are exempt, Jesus said to him. But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours.
Okay, so it's a little odd story, right? And this is one of those stories that you can always point to and say, this is why you don't read the Bible literally, right here, right here. Because this is what it looks like when you do, right? That's one of my favorites right there. Here's the question. How do we know this story is only in Matthew? So I'm going to show you some deep nerd stuff here. Hold on. My dogs are sure snoring a lot. Okay. This is an amazing reference that you're going to see. And it basically is a walk of the entire Bible. And it goes through all of the passages in the Bible, and it tells you where they exist. So here's that odd little story about the drachma. And you can see here that it's in Matthew, it's not in Mark, it's not in Luke, it's not in John. Okay. So this is something that biblical scholars use to kind of understand the differences between the Gospels. So let's look at this one, right? So this is the one we were just doing where Jesus is talking about how he's going to be betrayed. Sorry, it cuts over 2 pages. So it's in Matthew. And do you see in the Mark piece that in Mark, the disciples don't understand the statement and were afraid to ask, right? In the Luke is going to build on it a little bit. And John is not going to deal with it all. He's just going to say he didn't go to Judea because the Jewish leaders were going to try to kill him, right? So for every part of the Bible, we can do this crosswalk, right? And it's really, really interesting. I'm going to take you up to the top here and I'll show you how this looks at the very high level. At the very high level. So this is pretty interesting. So John has 96% new material. So when they do this analysis, so the vast majority of John is going to be original. So when we get to John, it's going to be like reading a different book. We're going to almost have to put everything aside because it's almost all original material. But Matthew is going to take 90% of Mark. So Matthew's just copying Mark and adding to it. And then Luke is the next kind of most unique one after John, because Luke is only going to take about 70% of Mark, and then he's going to add to it a ton of different stuff. So that's kind of the Venn diagram you can see of how Matthew and Luke run with this story. Okay. And if anybody's interested, because it really is interesting to kind of see, like, let's go back to the beginning, right? The genealogy, nothing else, anywhere else, right? The Luke story of the birth, it's not anywhere else. The Annunciation, nowhere else. Mary's visit to Elizabeth, the genealogy, it's in Matthew and Luke. And it really gets interesting once you start getting into, that's the Bible in me, the Bible nerd in me, saying that this is just deeply fascinating. When you get into look at like John the Baptist in terms of how each author is either coming up with fresh new material or building upon the material of someone before them. So, okay, that's my deep dive into Bible nerdiness for you all, so you can kind of see what the basis is of where this kind of understanding of what's in what. So, okay, let me, oops, hold on. Share again. We'll go back and we'll talk about this story. Okay, so this is easily one of the weirdest stories in the New Testament. So Here's the context behind it. And, again, this is why you don't take it literally and without of context. Context matters. Context shapes content. Context shapes content. That's so critical. So every Jew was supposed to pay this tiny sum every year to help support the temple in Jerusalem. Out of that temple tax, and the Romans also pulled their, but every Jew is paying into the temple tax. The tax collector came and said, look, is he going to pay? And Jesus doesn't believe it's proper, right? But this isn't the right time strategically for him to press the point. That time's going to come. So, pragmatically, it's better to pay the tax. Okay, how is that going to happen? Go fishing and find it there. So he's telling the fishermen, go to work for a couple days, get the tax, right? And in general, he's kind of making light of the whole system and making fun of it, but being very strategic about what to do in terms of engaging with the Roman Empire. So he's making some strategic decisions on what battle to fight at what point in time. Okay. Okay, let's talk about the greatest of these. Marie, will you read for us?
At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? He called a little child to him and placed the child among them, and he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea.
Very dramatic, huh? Thanks, Marie. Okay, it's a big point that he's trying to make here. And, going back to Bernie's point, did Jesus say this? Did he say that? So this is one of those things that you see this teaching. This seems to be a really core teaching of Jesus because you see it in all of the Gospels. And it's this teaching that the weakest, the most vulnerable, the least significant human being you can think of is the clearest possible sign of what the kingdom of God will be like, right? It is counterintuitive. It is countercultural. It is not about survival of the fittest. It isn't about the strongest, the fastest, the loudest, the angriest. He is basically saying, get rid of all of your concepts of what a hero is. And instead, it is this little vulnerable child. That is true greatness. That's what you have to go learn about. That's what you have to imitate. And then he's also saying that he's worried about the children themselves. They require protection because they're so vulnerable. And then he kind of basically lays down this really stark warning to anybody who's going to mess with anybody who is vulnerable, powerless, and at risk in the world. So this section right here, for those of you who are Catholics, this is the basis biblically of a lot of the Catholic focus on charity and good works. So this passage really has been used to inspire the preferential, I don't know the right words to say it, but this preferential focus on the most vulnerable that you see within the Catholic Church. And some of you Catholics might know that better than I do, what that language is. Okay, let's go on to chapter 18. We're going to talk about what to do when there's a little conflict. So Chris, will you take this one?
Yes. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you that if two of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them.
That's a pretty iconic way to end it. That's the 2 or 3 gather in my name, I am there. So, okay, so this is a story about reconciliation, and it's a pretty both practical and idealistic way to approach it, right? So what Jesus is saying here is forgiveness doesn't mean it didn't happen. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It didn't matter, right? It means acknowledging that it happened and then lays out this process of dealing with it and moving back into love and acceptance again anyway, okay? So first, you go to the person that injured you and you have that conversation, okay? If that doesn't work and you're not able to kind of find a path forward together, then you choose people who can go with you. And if that doesn't work, then you turn to the whole community to kind of support that process of reconciliation. If after all of that, the person does not choose to reconcile, then they're treated as an outcast. And there's 2 different ways kind of to look at it. One of this is maybe that instead of thinking of them as outcasts, is establishing healthy boundaries. Like if you can't move forward in right relationship, that you don't have a relationship with that individual, right? So having those boundaries in place. So this is kind of a step-by-step guide that you'll see in a lot of evangelical churches when there's conflict, that there'll be an encouragement to go one-on-one, and then to take an elder from the church to go in, and then the whole community. It's been abused in a lot of respects when you introduce power components like elders or ministers into that problem solving. So yeah, so that's it. And then this is the other thing I want to make sure you knew is this, the way he ends it, 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am with you, only in Matthew. It's not in any other gospel. So that is unique to Matthew. So, okay. So we're going to talk about, this is what we're going to do for reflection. I'm going to break you up into groups. So we're going to go back to that kind of really countercultural emphasis on the vulnerable and the weak. Toss out your images of a hero and instead put in their place the most vulnerable, the weakest, and which really aligns with what he was teaching, even just back starting with the Beatitudes, right? This is an echo of what we heard in the Beatitudes. So here's the question for your small groups. Who are the little ones in our society? The least powerful, the most vulnerable? And how are we called to walk with them? That's one set of questions. The other is, who are the greatest, the most powerful? And how are we called to challenge them? Okay. So that's the question I'm going to send you out with. Does that make sense? Okay, let me get these set. One, two, three, four. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and I'm going to give you okay, just one caveat. Don't talk about the 2024 election. So just keep that one out. Okay. I'm going to give you about 8 minutes on this one. Okay. And I'll post the questions out to everybody. Everybody got the questions?
Yes.
Enjoy. Okay, now you two stayed the whole time.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Welcome back.
Those were quite the questions, Pastor Marci.
Aren't they quite the questions? I just want to show you back to that document I showed you all, right?
Yes.
So this is where this passage is. And remember, this is how biblical scholars kind of think about this is if it is in all four gospels. So think of 4 different geographic communities, 4 different theological communities, 4 different cultural communities that created these gospels. 4 different communities are going to come up with the same thing when it's in those. Like one of the few things that's in there is the feeding of the crowds. That's in all 4. This is one that is in all 4. So even John has it. A little different in some of them, but you know, you could kind of say the emphasis on all of them. It's there. So okay, so what'd y'all come up with?
Well, Steve thinks we should all read the Heaven on Earth Grocery Store, which is really addresses this whole thing.
That is
I
on my
like that
reading
book.
list.
It's I read that. It's a great book.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't read it yet.
Oh, you'll like it.
Okay, the Heaven and Earth grocery store recommendation.
Mhm.
Wrote that down.
Well, we talked about that church down in Tukwila
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
and actually doing something about it.
Yep.
Yeah, we basically danced around without actually using the word humility all the way through the whole discussion. The abandonment of individual power, riches, and distinction, going for that the people in the kingdom are humble.
A rare trait.
Yeah.
Okay. What else did y'all come up with?
Well, Chris pointed out, and this is kind of the opposite of humble, that she found as she grew in her knowledge and wisdom that people who are arrogant really are probably afraid of something. And so they're putting this on. And so in a way, they too are vulnerable.
Wow. Okay, that's an interesting kind of thought. Is
I don't know if Chris's back is still here, but she
is saying
pointed out.
yeah,
that-
Chris can't use her microphone. So
Mhm.
she texted me. Okay, that's an interesting thought. So last week in pub theology, we had the question about how to get over judgment, and it came, I think, for those of you that were there, it really focused and centered around hearing the stories. That the closer we get to the authentic stories of a human being, the more likely we are to let our judgments and preconceived beliefs and understandings drop away, right? And so what you're saying, Marie, is in your group, you maybe the people that we think of as the most in control and the most powerful, that the closer we get to their sacred stories, the more we may understand them with compassion as vulnerable. So if I heard,
Well, but I think we were also talking about the fact that the people who have the great riches or had the huge corporations, that kind of thing, and then maybe written up in the newspaper more, and maybe seen as powerful, may not always be the power sources in our lives, and that we may have a second grade teacher who had profound effect on us and therefore had quite a bit of power with us, and it was not based on money or acclaim. And then we have other examples of that sort of thing throughout life, and we probably all have opportunities to try to even be that person in some respect, whether it's in some form of giving to others.
okay, great. Any final thoughts on this one? It's a
Well,
big.
Steve had a great quote that he left us with just before we had to leave the room, and that is, capitalism is not kind. And this country is a capitalistic society. Capitalism is king, right? And it is not kind.
Yep. Yep. Which begs a whole bigger discussion about the congruency between, or lack thereof, between Christianity or following the way and the economic models we see in the world.
Mhm. Mhm.
I have
Oh.
another book recommendation then. The Covenant of the Water is about India and the caste system, and it's somewhat the same thing. They're getting to where the Marxists are rising, because that's the only way that they're going to get away from the caste system.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's another book recommendation.
Oh, I read that. It's one of my favorite books.
The
Oh.
Covenant of Water. Yeah.
Yes. That author he's amazing.
Okay, we're at the end. We only have 3 more sessions on Matthew, so you can imagine we're starting to turn towards Jerusalem. So I think it's 19 to 22 for next week. We're not that far from the end. So I will see you all on a week from today. Again, 3 more times of Matthew. Then we'll have 2 weeks off. And then anybody who wants to come back for the something about the Marys, we're going to do that one in March.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thanks for humoring my Bible nerdiness. Take care, everyone.